Why is Africa still poor and way behind European countries, despite having more natural resources? Interestingly, Europe was the one that prospered by draining and plundering African resources and reached where it is today. But today, colonialism does not exist, and African countries are free to make their choices. Yet, despite this, why can't African countries achieve the same level of progress and modernity as European countries did by using African resources? Well, that's when the answer goes beyond simple colonialism, changing into something most people cannot see and trace due to the precise and calculated strategy of secrecy. So, while being practical, why is Africa still poor? Welcome to a new episode of Black Afric Diary, a channel where we talk about Black African history, culture, arts, and civilization. It's a place where you will see the real picture of Black Africa, its stories, and the events defining it. In this episode, we will explain why Africa is poor, with the answer not being colonization, but something else. Let's get started. Africa's current economic challenges cannot be entirely blamed on colonialism. However, the sins of colonialism cannot be whitewashed as well. The lingering effects of its horrible legacy continue to play a significant role in shaping the continent's development. Colonialism was not just a historical event. It laid the foundation for many of the issues Africa faces today, including weak economic structures, political instability, and underdevelopment. While Africa certainly has the power to shape its future, understanding how Europe thrived on African resources while halting Africa's own progress is key to understanding the continent's struggles. During the colonial era, European powers like Britain, France, Portugal, and Belgium viewed Africa as a vast source of raw materials to fuel their own economic growth. These colonial powers deliberately structured African economies around exporting raw materials, such as minerals and cash crops, back to Europe. Little effort was made to develop industries or infrastructure in Africa, creating economies that were entirely dependent on resource extraction. This exploitation allowed Europe to prosper while leaving African nations without the industrial base necessary to process their own resources or create sustainable jobs. The legacy of resource extraction meant that African countries became reliant on exporting diamonds, cocoa, rubber, and oil, while Europe reaped the benefits. Meanwhile, African nations remained underdeveloped, with little to no industrialization. Upon gaining independence, many African countries were left ill-equipped to manage their economies, as they lacked the infrastructure and industries needed for long-term growth. This was done intentionally, so that whenever they got independence, they would either collapse or ask for their former colonial help. This extractive economic model made African nations vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices, a problem that continues to affect many African economies today. In addition to economic exploitation, colonialism left behind a legacy of political instability. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers during the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 ignored Africa's ethnic, cultural, and linguistic diversity, often grouping rival communities within the same borders or splitting unified groups across different colonies. These artificial borders sowed the seeds for future conflicts and political tensions that continue to plague African nations. After gaining independence, many African countries struggled with internal conflicts as rival ethnic groups, forced together by colonial borders, vied for power. Countries like Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo continue to grapple with the consequences of these imposed borders, facing civil wars and political unrest. The instability created by these borders also contributed to military coups and authoritarian regimes, further disrupting development and deterring foreign investment. The instability that resulted from colonial borders has had long-lasting effects on Africa's ability to develop stable governments and economies. Even though formal colonialism ended in the mid-20th century, its effects persist through a more subtle form of neocolonialism. This is particularly evident in the relationship between France and its former African colonies. Although these countries are technically independent, many remain economically and politically tied to France through mechanisms like the CFA franc and exclusive resource rights. The CFA franc is a currency used by 14 African nations and is controlled by the French treasury, limiting the economic sovereignty of these nations and keeping them dependent on France. It's unbelievable how this continues to this day, but the reality is that African countries that are part of the CFA franc system are required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves into the French treasury. This system, which includes 14 African countries, has been in place since the creation of the CFA franc in the 1940s. In addition to this 50% deposit, the member countries also contribute another 20% to cover financial liabilities, meaning about 70% of their reserves are effectively controlled by France. This arrangement gives France significant influence over the monetary policies of these African nations, limiting their financial sovereignty and contributing to economic dependency. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. Additionally, France retains exclusive rights to extract and purchase resources like uranium and oil, ensuring that it continues to benefit from Africa's wealth while providing little return to the African nations involved. This form of neo-colonialism has kept many African countries under the influence of external powers that continue to extract wealth from the continent while limiting its ability to control its own resources. Therefore, although these countries gained independence, their economies and policies are still shaped by the interests of their former colonizers, preventing true economic freedom and progress. However, despite the challenges left behind by colonialism, many African nations are beginning to chart a new path forward by embracing economic freedom and implementing reforms that encourage entrepreneurship, investment, and innovation. Countries like Rwanda, Mauritius, and Botswana have shown that with the right policies, it is possible to overcome historical disadvantages and achieve rapid growth. By focusing on good governance, reducing corruption, and promoting free market principles, these nations are building more resilient economies that can thrive in the global market. For example, under the leadership of President Paul Kagame, Rwanda has embraced a vision inspired by Singapore's economic success. By creating a business-friendly environment, cutting bureaucratic red tape, and investing in infrastructure, Rwanda has transformed into one of Africa's fastest-growing economies, despite its troubled past. This model of economic reform demonstrates that African countries can overcome the challenges of their colonial legacy and build strong, prosperous futures. That's when we have to think beyond colonialism. One of the biggest hurdles to economic growth in Africa is political instability. Many countries face conflicts, coups, and authoritarian regimes that disrupt governance and economic systems. Instead of focusing on long-term development, some leaders maintain power through corruption, diverting state resources for personal gain. This misappropriation of funds pulls resources away from critical areas such as infrastructure, education, and public services, stifling economic progress and improvements in living standards. Corruption further weakens Africa's economic position by channeling public money into private pockets. Transparency. International often ranks several African countries low on its corruption perception index, highlighting how widespread the problem is. You should know that corruption does not just impact public services, it also discourages foreign investment. Investors fear losing their money to corrupt systems, which deprive economies of the capital and innovation they desperately need to grow. Alongside corruption is the issue of weak governance. Many African governments lack transparency and accountability, leading to inefficient use of resources. Rather than pursuing sustainable economic growth, some focus on short-term gains or personal enrichment, neglecting the policies and structures essential for long-term development. Without strong leadership and institutions, it's tough to create the stable environment necessary for economic growth and investment. In most cases, the African leaders engaging in corruption are West's puppets. They also make their countries' economies debt-driven. Much of this debt was accumulated during periods of political instability and poor governance, and now repaying these loans consumes large portions of government budgets. As a result, less money is available for crucial areas like healthcare, education, and infrastructure, trapping countries in a cycle of poverty where debt repayments take priority over much-needed investments in development. While foreign aid can offer temporary relief, it often has long-term negative effects. Aid can create dependency, where governments rely on external support rather than developing their own economies. This reliance reduces the incentive to invest in local industries or implement economic reforms. In most cases, African leaders win elections after getting backing from the West, becoming Western-backed puppets. They favor Western government policies and corporations at the expense of their own nations. These leaders often prioritize Western interests, allowing foreign companies to extract Africa's resources for a fraction of their worth, while ignoring the pressing needs of their own people. This long-standing arrangement has left many African countries vulnerable, dependent, and economically stunted. However, there have been brave leaders who resisted this exploitative system and worked to make their nations truly independent and prosperous. Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, Patrice Lumumba of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya were among the leaders who stood up against Western control. These leaders advocated for self-reliance, economic independence, and the use of Africa's resources to benefit its own people rather than Western powers. Unfortunately, their revolutionary ideas were met with hostility from outside their countries. They were assassinated, their deaths widely believed to have been orchestrated by forces that opposed their anti-colonial and pro-African agendas. Fortunately, a new generation of African leaders is emerging, following in the footsteps of these visionaries. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, General Abdourahmane Chiani of Niger, and Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali are taking bold stands against the influence of Western governments and corporations. These leaders are pushing for economic sovereignty and policies that prioritize their people over foreign interests. By nationalizing resources, rejecting exploitative foreign deals, and seeking new alliances outside the traditional Western sphere of influence, they aim to build truly independent nations. Their efforts have already started to show results. In countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, these leaders have begun shifting their nations away from reliance on Western powers, focusing on developing their own industries and forming stronger alliances with other African nations, China and Russia. They are showing that Africa can prosper if its leaders prioritize the welfare of their own people and take control of their resources. What do you think? Is colonialism the reason why Africa is poor today? Isn't it true that the West always uses handlers within African countries and uses them as tools to achieve its interests? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on why Africa could not prosper like various other former colonies like Singapore. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.